Okay, so today I'm joined by three guests. And because this is an SCCJR session, what we usually try to do is have guests from other universities that are members of the SCCJR, and then also have a guest from our international partners network. So I'll start in no particular order as they are here. So my first guest is Micha Hafner, who is from the University of Ljubljana. My second guest is Fergus McNeill, who is from the University of Glasgow. And my third guest is Francesca Soliman from the Edinburgh Napier University. I'm looking down as if I don't know their names, but I do very well know their names because I've been collaborating with all of them before. So I will then just ask my questions and we can kind of perhaps use the same order. So Micha, if you want to introduce yourself just a little bit, tell us what you've been working on, what are your research interests, and how do you kind of relate to this type of session?
With in teaching, actually, my main subject is criminal procedure. I do a bit less teaching in criminology. However, my research is somewhere in between criminal law and criminology. I'm interested in the intersection of psychology and criminal law, cognitive sciences, neurosciences, and criminal law. So this is kind of my research interest area. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. Fergus? Fergus, you're muted.
Sorry, I know, classic way to begin. I never mute myself normally. I don't know why I bothered in this meeting. Anyway, I'll give you a very short intro because I think I've got a little bit of biography to add when I answer the first question. So briefly, I study institutions, cultures, and practices of punishment, rehabilitation, and reintegration.
Great, thank you. Francesca.
Now, I feel the need to be very concise as well now. In a nutshell, what I research is social harms, usually as consequences of policies. It has been migration policy. I'm currently looking at counterterrorism policy, and I have a little project I'm trying to get off the ground, looking at the criminalization of wildlife crime.
Great, thank you so much. So I kind of knew most of the things in advance, but some new things as well. Okay, so can we just kick off this conversation maybe from, because I myself, when I thought about this session, I realized I have a lot of thoughts about this, but I don't really have any engagement with human subjects as research participants, which feels a bit weird, given that I'm a criminologist. That was kind of one of the main reasons why I wanted to have the guests I'm having, because I feel all of my three guests have much more experience, and I'm hoping some thoughts as well that are connected to this. But I do remember a few years back, I was writing an article, and as I was writing it, well, it was a chapter actually. As I was writing it, I realized I had to read a specific book. And it was Stanley Cohen's States of Denial. And I was sitting in my office and I was reading this book. And at some point, I started having a lot of feelings and a lot of thoughts, which never happened to me before, given that I've done this work for quite a long time so far. I kind of, whenever I read something for work, I felt like a very disassociated observer of whatever was happening. And reading about human stories, it did make me have feelings, but not genuine emotions. But when I started reading this book, and the book is obviously, most of you will know, all of you will know about the ways in which we are able to witness and think about atrocities, but don't really engage with them. So the question is like, how do we live with ourselves, knowing that so many people suffer? And what are some of the processes that we basically use to disassociate ourselves from this? All of a sudden, I felt that I wasn't disassociated anymore. And I spent most of that book, I spent reading that book, crying the whole time. And it felt really weird. And I thought, this is not normal. This is a day in the office. I'm sitting in my office. I had to lock my door at some point because I really didn't want people to come in finding me crying. And then I thought, do other criminologists have these feelings? How do they approach, reading and thinking about these topics? Or was I perhaps the slightly crazy one? So I just thought, do you think you invest yourselves as humans when you read about things, when you research things, and when you teach them? I don't know. I mean, I know Francesca definitely has had some thoughts about this when she was doing her previous research on xenological harms in Lampedusa. This is not just about the role that you play as a researcher, about ethics and these kinds of things, but how much do the stories that you read and then that you tell impact you as a human being? So that's my kind of first, very open question.
Shall I go first?
Yes,
to get
because
going?
you're unmuted, so why not use
Exactly. So yeah, well, yeah. Let me answer it partly biographically, and then I'll kind of try and broaden out from my own experience. So I, as an undergraduate, I didn't study social sciences at all. I studied history and philosophy. And the philosophy part of that was moral and political philosophy. So I spent a lot of time very earnestly in my youth trying to figure out what I believed, what my core values were, what my politics were, and what I wanted to do in the world. And at the end of that, I thoroughly enjoyed my studies, but I decided at the young age of 20, because I was 20 when I graduated, that I needed some life experience and I needed to kind of put my values into practice and see how they worked out, basically. So I volunteered and I worked first of all in a residential drug rehab, and I lived in it for 3 years eventually. So very close to people's experiences of addiction and recovery, and also almost by accident, I became a practitioner. So practitioners are humanly invested in what they do. So I think when we nowadays speak about lived experience, we sometimes forget that practitioners and academics and policymakers and politicians and bystanders and everybody has lived experience, and my lived experience became that of a person working in a drug rehab, and then I trained as a social worker and practiced in the justice system as a social worker. So I was humanly involved in criminal justice before I studied it as a subject. That came a bit later for me, and it's never seemed plausible to me to be other than humanly present and engaged with the work, whether the work is teaching, research, reading, exchanging knowledge, engaging with wider publics. So in a sense, the kind of the human connection, I just think it's unavoidable. In fact, I think that as I was preparing, I was thinking about detachment and proximity and the way in which those are discussed in methods textbooks, and it struck me for the first time, and maybe this is also part of what Cohen is arguing indirectly. Detachment is a product of privilege. Right? To be able to detach yourself from atrocities or from any difficult life experience, whether it's poverty or punishment or crime victimization or whatever, to be able to detach from it and look at it with supposed objectivity and distance is a product of privilege and a process of privileging yourself, taking yourself back and looking from a distance. And that isn't available to everybody. And there are things to be gained from that, to be sure, and I think we'll come back to those later. But there are also things that can only be seen and understood close up. So proximity, to me, matters as much as distance. And when I'm teaching, I think what I'm trying to do is help students move between positions of proximity and distance. So sometimes they get closer to experiences, usually experiences that aren't their own, but sometimes it might be their own experience. And at other times, we're helping them to step back and see things in broader perspective and from other vantage points. But whether you're close or distant, you're still humanly involved. You're still a human actor trying to make sense of a social world, and the position that you occupy might change, but your humanity is still part of what you're doing, or it should be. So that's where I start, I think.
Thanks, Fergus. Do you feel like you've changed, I mean, throughout your professional career, from starting from there to now? And if so, what's changed?
I think there are day-to-day oscillations between proximity and distance, but there are also kind of longer term trends. So when I was living alongside people in a drug rehab, that was very proximate. And although I was a worker, I also counted those people as my friends. I cohabited with them. I shared meals with them every day. So what happened to them was something that I felt as if it were happening to my almost family, because we were living together and were close in emotional terms. When I became a social worker, I was taught to try and put more distance between me and my clients. There's a phrase that's used in social work training, or was back in the 1990s, which was controlled emotional involvement, which was about not about being empathic, but also trying to maintain a little bit of professional distance. The theory being that you needed it in order to be helpful and not to be swept along by whatever was happening to your clients. And I sort of see the point, but also have some issues with that. And then I think as I became an academic, I probably, like lots of people trying to deal with imposter syndrome, the first part of that experience, I was trying to be like an academic, which meant distance and detachment and evidence and rigor and all those words. And it took me probably quite a long time to wind my way back to proximity as a virtue and a value. And in some respects that happened to me by accident as a result of things that I was discovering through research and through knowledge exchange activities, and through, particularly more recently, through the development of research which involves creative methods which involve vulnerability, and by that I mean my own as well as that of people I'm working with. So yeah, there are oscillations every day, and there are kind of longer term trends, and I think I'm more at the proximate end of things now than I was 10 years ago, but I still need distance, and I think everybody does. I think, to give you a concrete example and then I'll shut up, when we were doing the Distant Voices project, which used creative practices to explore reintegration after state punishment, we had a core group of people with all kinds of experience which guided that project, and we went on residential retreats to analyze data together and to kind of direct the project. And that was interesting because that was us collectively finding distance from what we were doing. But it wasn't only the academic in the ivory tower that was able to have distance and look from a distance. Everybody involved in the project found distance, and everybody involved in the project went right back into the knee-deep shit of the field afterwards. Sorry for the language, but trying to kind of make clear the contrast between those two experiences. But I think that's what good teachers do as well, is that they help us occupy both proximate and detached positions and move between them in ways that help us make more sense, and also escape common sense and taken for granted assumptions that you might form in proximity, interrogate at distance, and then come back in and see different things when you come back the next time.
Yeah, that's great. So I think we might come back to this kind of the ways in which we might expand opportunities for students themselves to participate in these types of activities and learn something from them, not necessarily learn in the way of learning, but experience something from them. Thanks, Fergus. Micha, did you have any thoughts about sensitive topics and your involvement in them?
Yeah, I guess my research experience is much different than Fergus or Francesca's. And I guess, the question you ask, you really can't know how these things will impact you before you start doing some research. So I remember, to give an example, I was involved in a research looking into homicide cases in Slovenia. So we actually analyzed a whole bunch of homicide cases from 1990s till 2000s. And before started reading these transcripts, I really psychologically prepared myself. I said, okay, this is going to be tough, brace yourself. And once I started reading this stuff, I realized in a weird way, I could get detached, as Fergus said. I could read it as some kind of literature, as weird as it sounds. So I was surprised myself to see that actually I could actually take the subject matters from almost like a natural science approach. Like, you know, this is something I research, and of course, there were, hard stuff also, gruesome stuff to go through. But I was maybe, I'm a risk here of being perceived as some kind of robot, but I was actually quite surprised myself that I could get detached and desensitized in a way. However, I guess this is also, it depends, like if you work with people personally, I think it's a very simple explanation. I remember just after law school, I was practicing law for a very, very short time, for less than a year. And then, then you meet people, you see their life stories, you get to know them. And I remember that in those experiences actually touched me emotionally or psychologically much more than these cases I read, although, it could be very simple, life stories of somebody breaking a leg and, suing an insurance company and, being poor and so on. But this I found much more moving or touching than maybe something that I did as a researcher.
Yeah, no, I think it's, definitely there's a personal element to it, as you say. So it's kind of seeing real people with real faces, but I also feel like it's about you as a person and where you are. So I remember while I was reading and crying the states of I'll never read that book again. It did very much coincide with a time where I had become a mother, maybe a year or two before that. And it was about children, and you could kind of, I had a completely different perception, and it felt really wrong because I thought, like, should it really depend on the fact that I'm a mother and so on, I have all these feelings? But it did kind of strike me very differently as a person. And it is at that point I started realizing, okay, how much do we really invest ourselves in what we do? Thanks. Francesca, any thoughts?
Yeah, so it just struck a nerve now that you said, you mentioned you had recently become a mom, and I also have recently become a mom, and I think it just really does change. I think it's the constant, you suddenly have this constant feeling that you have a duty to protect, and then reading about children who are being harmed somehow seems to touch a different nerve. I find I cannot really read migration-related news the same way. And it does feel, it feels wrong because like that this was also mattered before, and it's not like, different blood, but it just goes to show that it is about something that when something just connects with something in you, whether it's there or not. The sensitivity of criminological topics, very, widely understood. As Miha said, you can never really predict what's going to affect you and how long things might be bubbling under the surface before you actually realize that, maybe you've been struggling with something. When I came back from my field work in Lampedusa, which wasn't necessarily a walk in the park for me, but I didn't witness any loss of life. I didn't witness any shipwrecks. Like, it was a very calm time. It was a time of calm in the Mediterranean as well. And after I came back for quite a few weeks, I was following the fate of the Aquarius ship that was being denied entry in Italy. So all I was doing was literally just look at the graphs of the ship trackers apps. The boat was not shipwrecked. Everybody was rescued. It did find a port of entry in the end. And I wasn't looking at pictures of people. I was just looking at simple graphs of a dot moving and being quite detached really from the reality of it. And then one day, I remember I was at a gym that had an outdoors pool with the nice blue water, and there were two young black boys playing in the water, and it was the sight of a floating body with black skin on a blue background, and it just broke me, and I just broke down. And I had never thought about these images. I purposefully avoid looking at these images as much as I can, but it's there, it's in our consciousness. As much as we detach ourselves from extremely traumatic event, we know what it is that we're talking about. And I think, there is no way to detach completely, as much as we might try, because we do need to defend our emotional well-being as well. Sometimes it's something you can't avoid, and it is a huge privilege to be able to do so. But yeah, sometimes you just can't. You just have to stop, take a moment, take stock, realize that maybe it's a bit too much, and try take a break, and exercise this privilege that we have of being able to take a break.
Yeah, I explicitly remember from reading Francesca's research a number of different things. I mean, one of them was this kind of the ethical concerns of doing research in a very densely populated research area such as Lampedusa, where you have a number of researchers and people are, if I can interpret it, a bit sick of talking to researchers, and kind of and then you yourself start obviously asking yourself how much you're exploiting basically people to do your own research. So, okay, great, thanks. If we have any questions or any thoughts, just please feel super free to raise your hands and or type in the chat box. I was thinking, so this is, okay, this all relates to ourselves and us doing research. So there is an added element or level of responsibility, I guess. Once you have your research findings, or once you've read someone else's research findings, and once you have to kind of translate what you've learned, we, I think, become aware of the extent of kind of the translation and modification that we ourselves have to do to, make them digestible or relevant, because obviously we don't just teach research as it is. We do conduct a level of translation for that. How much does this role of kind of translating and trying to convey the findings of either your own research or someone else's research make you feel uncomfortable, or kind of causing you some negative emotions or negative, well, not necessarily emotions, but how do you kind of grapple with having to be a conductor of the research you've written and trying to represent it to someone else, knowing that obviously this is a process that's involved a lot of negotiation and a lot of kind of self-reflection? Do you have any kind of strategy or thoughts about how this is done, and what does it require from you? What kind of responsibilities do you have based on that? Fergus has unmuted again.
Yeah,
so.
I've got so many thoughts on this
yes,
one.
Oh, I'm glad.
So again, to reference Distant Voices, we had a whole strand in that project where we agonized for most of the 4 years on the question, whose voice? We just had that as a continuous question, and something that we discussed endlessly in our research team and in our wider community of inquiry. And I guess I've got like two practical things to say. One is, if you are a translator, then I'm not sure that's the right phrase actually, but if you are a translator who is communicating about other people's experiences, which have been communicated to you in their language, their words, then in our field, maybe unlike in translation, I think you need to locate yourself. So when you're presenting findings, to put it in everyday language for us, you need to kind of acknowledge who you are, so that at least the listener has some sense of how you might be refracting stories that you've heard. Obviously, the answer to this question depends on the kind of methods that you use. Well, the other thing I would do is, if I am gifted somebody else's story, and the Latin word for datum is gift. If I'm gifted someone's story, then I always try to pay attention to the conditions under which it's given, and to, wherever possible, check that my understanding of it and the way that I'm going to tell it is acceptable to the person who gave it to me. And that involves lots of dialogue, and in the case of Distant Voices, an awful lot of toing and froing to see whether people maintained informed consent to the way that we were going to present their stories as their lives unfolded over the course of years. So, you might feel one way about that when you're a single person, another person when you're another way when you're in a couple, and another way when you're a parent, to give you an example. In fact, I've got a previous project where we filmed a woman talking in great depth about her experience of the criminal justice system and of desistance from crime. And it was brilliant footage, and it was going to go in a film, which was to enhance public understanding of desistance. And then, long after the filming, she thought about her children and whether there was a prospect that her children and her children's friends would see this footage. And we had lengthy discussions and eventually pulled all of that content from the film, because that was ultimately her decision. So consent to be a translator, or permission to translate, if you like, I think it's never permanent. And even if you can't go back to the person, you still have to keep on holding yourself to account and trying to remember the context in which the story was told and the conditions under which it was negotiated that it could be shared. And then the last thing I'll say is that sometimes, as a way of dealing with this now, particularly again in projects with creative methods, I prefer to share as much of the story unmediated as I can. So I find myself giving talks now where I use large extracts of interview transcripts with no interpretation from me, just the words of the participant. And admittedly, then I'll go into a discussion and put myself into the story, or my understanding into the interpretation. But at least the person has, in a sense, spoken in their own voice about the topic at hand. And the same is true in Distant Voices in relation to the way that songs exist as artifacts which contain experience and communicate experience in a way which is very carefully negotiated. So yeah, I think it's basically thinking hard about the context in which a story is shared, thinking about the conditions under which you can use it, the constraints on how you use it, the way you frame it, the way that you explain yourself as a translator, and the way in which you think about the limits of consent. And ultimately, I think I want to kind of step back a little bit from that traditional academic thing of saying that I, as a researcher or a scholar, have the authority to make sense of other people's experiences. You know, to me, that is epistemically unjust and at times can become arrogant. Sometimes you have to interpret, you have to own your responsibility as a researcher, but you have to do it with such care and such sensitivity, and also, if you can, with a degree of humility. So those are my kind of ways of thinking about that. Can I just throw one other phrase into the mix? Yeah, just, and then I'll shut up. It reflects back on the last question and what you and Francesca mentioned about becoming mothers, and it actually also relates to what Miha said. When I was young, I read a book of short stories by John Updike, American writer, and one of the short stories was about a father taking his daughter to the dentist, and she's got toothache, and she has to go through a painful procedure in the dentist chair, and he's observing, and he's asking himself the question, would I take this pain on myself if I could? And he's kind of ruminating back and forward about the honest answer to that question. And he just comes up with this amazing phrase, the space of indifference is where we breathe, which I've always remembered. And I think it's kind of what Miha was describing, you know, and again, it relates to my earlier point that sometimes I think we should not allow ourselves the space of indifference. And sometimes we must have it to psychologically survive what we're doing and be useful to the people that we're working alongside. So the kind of question of how to move between indifference and being overwhelmed emotionally, as you've described yourselves, that's tricky. But sometimes we have to give ourselves indifference and let that be, and sometimes not.
Yeah, no, I think that's a number of fair points. There's one kind of conflict that I feel. I mean, one way you're describing is that you're trying to introduce some distance in the sense of kind of saying, well, I'm just going to give you these words and you will read them, and I won't interpret this. But sometimes I'm very aware of the fact that you, as a researcher and then a teacher, are almost the only one who understands this kind of dissonance between what people are saying and how this might be interpreted. And knowing the limitations that students might be experiencing in understanding this. So there is a level of kind of translation which is, as you say, it's a privilege to be able to, and a lot of responsibility comes with that. So that's kind of, on the one hand, you want to step back and kind of say, take this as it is, do your own work, interpret this the way you want, but then at the same time, you are in that position in which you are almost the only one who can do that.
That's true, and also you were the only one who saw what was unsaid.
Yeah,
and which
exactly. So that's
might be important for interpretation. So I wasn't saying that we should avoid the responsibility. What I was trying to say is that as far as possible, we should also try to present it. Again, it depends on the project, it depends on the research question, it depends on the method. But in my case, it's about trying to make sure that I give as much of the account that I've received as I can before I claim interpretative authority and impose my story on that story.
Yeah, great. Kirsten, thanks so much for the question. I'll relate to it just in a second. Micha, Francesca, any thoughts about those issues?
Yeah, that question you asked, like the sensitivity of translating research findings to other people. I think it's really important, as the research it always echoes in a specific social reality, right? It's never just goes in a abstract space. So that's dilemma I've faced recently when we were doing research on Slovenian judges, basically with real criminal law judges. We did this research with Mojca Plesničar, which Milena, you know very well, and Katja Šugman. And well, the research question was whether and how possible biases and stereotypes that judges might have, how they influence their judicial decisions, and if they influence them. Actually, at the end of the day, we realized that there's no measurable impact, but that their decisions, there's a lot of noise in their decisions, basically that there's a huge discrepancy in judges deciding identical cases, which is not a good news, right? If you're a judge. However, we've done this research in a very specific time in Slovenia, where we had a very populistic right-wing government with a prime minister who was convicted for corruption and who had a lot of problems with judiciary. And the whole media discourse of the right-wing media and the whole government political discourse was targeting judiciary and was systemically undermining judicial authority. They even, they coined the term criminal injustice system, and they would use that term consistently, and it would actually stick in the public. People in the street would call, oh yeah, the Slovenian injustice system. So we had a big problem. How do we translate our findings in a very toxic environment that was actually, undermining judicial authority? And because we, as researchers, we believe that Slovenian justice system is pretty much decent. We don't have any huge systemic problems, but that was something problematic that we found out, and we didn't know how to actually how to translate that to that very specific discourse that was in our country at the time. So we thought that when presenting these findings, we should really stress our opinion that generally the criminal justice system is solid, it's robust, that we don't think the judges are impartial, we don't think they are unprofessional or whatever. And with these caveats, then we very carefully introduced our findings. And I guess this is important, because if you don't have if you're not aware of the social reality, the message might get understood totally in a wrong way.
No, that's great, because I think what Fergus was talking about, I mean, the kind of when I thought about research participants, I always think about offenders, but and obviously you have all these kinds of considerations, knowing that they are vulnerable in many ways. But it's a very interesting example, because it just shows how other types of participants that you would not think are vulnerable necessarily might be, given the circumstances in which you work. And I think an additional kind of consideration that you make here is also how strong is the voice of the researchers in specific circumstances, knowing that the country, for instance, is small, there's a small number of researchers, whatever you write will be read by those who want to read it. So there's an additional kind of level, I guess, of consideration that you have to have in regard to that. That's great. Francesca.
Yeah, I think as you just pointed out, the nature of the findings you're thinking about, you're analyzing, you're presenting really influences how you would present them. I'm thinking about my PhD findings. My participants were a bystander community, the people who live on Lampedusa. It was already a community that had been researched over and over, who had lived through decades of highly politicized discourses. So when it was time to actually analyze this data, after running away from it from almost a year, trying to distance myself a bit from the experience of fieldwork, was hyper aware that those findings, even the transcriptions themselves, they were not untouched facts. There's no objective voices there. They were already shaped by the fact that I had asked questions. They were shaped by my presence. They were shaped by the presence of the people who had come there before me. They were shaped by things that these respondents had said to other people before I had arrived. They were shaped by the political climate of the time. So I quite rarely use quotes when I teach about migration or borders, and when I rely on my fieldwork. I very rarely present quotes because these circumstances make it very easy for them to be misinterpreted, because the context is far too complex. So in this case, I think it would be a disservice to the people who actually spoke to me. And there were a lot of things that I would say that actually didn't make it into the research themselves, because I didn't quite know how to present them the right way. And it was a mammoth task to translate these findings, to prioritize, deprioritize, simplify, reading between the lines, interpreting the silences, understanding what my role had been, and what my role was supposed to be. Was I the voice of the respondents? Was I unveiling existing truths? Was I constructing new ideas? So in a complex research environment like that, I think you just go back to your conceptual frameworks and just rely on those and use them as your roadmap and kind of hope for the best. Last year, I think it was, I presented a paper on environmental border harms at a conference, and I was asked, well, did your respondents actually conceptualize these events as environmental harms? And the truth is they had not. They never mentioned the word environment. They didn't perceive them as such. It wasn't even something that was universally recognized as a problem. It was just mentioned by a few people. It was my decision to interpret them as such, and my decision to present them that way. And it was a decision I made based on my belief that this type of harm was simply being kind of, not simply, but this was a way of constructing this harm that had been deprioritized, kind of hidden and concealed and silenced by all the other situations of crisis happening on the island. So there's a decision we make as researchers, and it does border on arrogance. Like, I agonized on that for quite some time. Yeah, and in the end, making the decision to conceptualize, present these findings, it's a massive, it is a mammoth task. And sometimes it seems to mean moving away quite a lot from the original findings. But I think sometimes to do justice to these findings, you have to ruminate and analyze quite a lot and dig through very, very many layers and meanings.
Now, I explicitly remember reading your research. This is a great piece of research. Thinking about things I had never thought about. Obviously, there's the way you kind of represent things. So even two languages, they don't say the same, right? If you write an original in Italian, it does say something a little bit different than it is in English. And also I remember, because you were looking at the bystanders, and I do remember kind of reading the quotes and thinking the extent of prejudice and stereotypes that's present among them. But then I could also see how within that context, you could somehow understand all these, problems and prejudices, stereotypes, but you couldn't translate them into research. So it's also about responsibility, not just, in a way that, you're now representing these people as if they're doing something really bad, but it could be understood within that context to some extent, but there's no way to represent it in research. So there's so many responsibilities to many different actors, I thought. Gillian, you had your hand up.
Yes, I did. Thanks for organizing this. It's so lovely, really, really love it. And thanks to everyone who's been talking. Just that last question just made me think about my PhD, which was carried out in a women's prison over 6 months, kind of ethnographic research. And when it came to presenting the sort of policy briefing paper back to all the involved parties, I was in the prison and lots of the women were there. And at the end, any questions, one of the women said, you just think we're all poor wee women. And I make choices in my life. I go outside, I take crack, I hurt people, I kill people. I'm not just a poor wee woman. And it really gave me pause for thought, that I was kind of interpreting their lives. And I was using like a feminist framework. So it wasn't like, really positivist or something, but, sort of imposing a structural intersectional analysis. And that maybe didn't reflect their interpretations of their own lives either. So I think that's a real tension at times. It gave me sort of pause with what I did then with the findings. And I've been kind of, before I sort of published the monograph, putting the narratives sort of back together, taking a step back, bringing my analysis back slightly. And my projects since then have been participatory action research, because it's made me think about our position as the sort of interpreters of people's knowledge, and how instead we should perhaps be the facilitators of them telling their own story in the way they want to.
Great, thank you. No, I think this is like a kind of very personal moment at which you start thinking about what is it that you're doing and how you're going about. And that's kind of, if it's just about, not just about, but if there's one level of, presenting your findings and talking about findings, and then there's another level which I want us to talk about in the next period of time. How do you then tell this to students? Because you know that there is a level of uncritical acceptance of whatever you say. Sometimes when you're marking essay, you kind of see your own words and students kind of referring to them as something that's given. So there's a kind of an added element of responsibility there as well. Thanks, Gillian, so much for the question. Did you have any thoughts about or responses?
Are we going to just keep going in the same order, or should we mix it up for this one?
Yeah, just whatever, whoever feels happy to speak.
I don't mind speaking, but
Yeah,
I don't want to keep on being the first.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, just to pick up on the two questions so far, also remembering Kirsten's in the chat. So that's a question about whether we need to be activists.
Yeah.
Do you want to just ask it, Kirsten, actually? So before.
Sure. Hi, everybody. No, I'm just thinking about teaching criminology, and especially for those of us who've been practitioners in various parts of the criminal justice system, or involved in other ways in practice, or not, even just as scholars. Can we teach criminology well and not be activists? How does that, if it does influence your teaching and the way that you teach? I'd be interested to hear from them.
Well, the reason I got you to kind of ask that question now is that my answer to it also relates to my answer to Gillian, which is that I actually think that a division of labor is okay. right? So I don't think every criminologist has to be an activist, unless actually we can make a different argument, which is to say that teaching is activism. And I think in a certain sense it is. And there are many ways of conceptualizing activism, from community building so that people have different experiences in communities that you're part of, through to political change and fighting for revolutions, right? So there's a massive span of different forms of activism. But I think a division of labour is okay, and I think it has to be okay for some people who are criminologists to say, my best contribution is to do excellent research. Other people can use it and engage with it. And I have some responsibility for how that happens, which takes us back to the question of translation and education in the public sphere. But nonetheless, I think it has to be okay. I think it also has to be okay to be a theorist, by the way. Just to be better at conceptualizing things and making sense of the world. And it relates to Gillian's question, because although I've also been drawn in the direction of doing participatory or collaborative action research increasingly, I don't think it's the only legitimate form of research. I'm sure Gillian doesn't think that either. It's just that certain kinds of inquiry might draw you in that direction, but it depends on your question, your interests, your concerns, and your agenda. So to get directly to this question, I do take really seriously the kind of authority that you're given when you're put at the front of a classroom, and the temptation to use that position for your own political or ideological purposes. I think that's something we have to struggle with. So I try to position myself with my students and try to let them know who I am and where I'm coming from, and practice the positionality that we teach in the classroom, as well as when I'm doing research. And the other thing that I try to do is help them do this proximity distance thing by making their own experience as well as their own reading and thinking relevant to the topic. So, the best example I can give of this is related to the Pervasive Punishment book, which is about supervision and how we understand its development and proliferation. And the book uses creative methods, including photography and songwriting and storytelling, to kind of try to bring those issues alive. And I try to get the students in the class to engage with those creative representations and think about them in relation to their own most proximate experience. So if you haven't been a subject of probation or parole, and most people in my classes haven't been and don't know somebody who has been, which might be a reflection of their privilege, but that's the truth in my classes, then I say, well, you've been supervised by your parents, you've been supervised by your teachers, you've probably been supervised in the workplace, you're being supervised now in relation to your studies. Take some of those experiences and look at these representations of supervision in a different context and think about what's similar and what's different and why. And those are questions that any human being can engage with without having to get into theory or research evidence, because the evidence that they're pulling on is the evidence of their own lives. And then we use that material to drive the rest of the teaching and learning experience. And we move from a reflective midterm, which is based on this kind of comparison of experiences, to more conventional sort of academic critical analysis. And my hope is that in doing that, not only am I being de-centered as the kind of provider of knowledge, but also they are putting themselves into the learning process in a different kind of way, which means that if their experience is different from the experience that I'm relating, then they have to deal with that dissonance and think about why. And they have to look for the theory that explains that, or the literature that explains it. And so that's some of how I try to do it, in admittedly the bit of my teaching that I've thought most about, because it's closest to my own interests, and because I have more resources to teach in that way, on that subject, because of my research. So
yeah, no, I think Kirsten's question, I I wasn't saving it for the end, but it kind of very much relates to the last question that I wanted to ask you, which is about the extent to which we can avoid being activists in a way, because there is a lot of unconscious activism that goes on in the classroom, which we might not realize. But can I just ask you before, because I do want for us to think a little bit about kind of practical strategies for getting students involved in these kinds of things. But can I ask you something about the extent to which you're all conscious about what you're saying in the classroom and how people hear it and what this might mean for you? So I have another kind of example from the time when I was a teacher in Serbia and would take students to prisons. Once I was taking students to prisons and to a prison, and the student knocked on my door and basically said, I just wanted to come forward and tell you that when we go to that prison, my brother's there, he's imprisoned in the prison. So I just wanted to let you know in advance, because if there are any security or, other types of problems. And I said, great, I mean, thanks for letting me know. Well, not great that he's in prison, but thanks for letting me know everything's fine. And then he said, but I also want to let you know that it's a really grave crime that he's perpetrated. It's a war crime. And I said, okay, it doesn't make any difference for anything. And then as soon as he left the room, I started thinking, because I was really deeply engaged with that particular group of students. This was the fourth subject, criminology related subject I had taught to them. And at some point I realized, I started going back through the years of teaching that young man and thinking about the kinds of things I had said, the kinds of representations I had made about people, and it made me feel really, really bad. Obviously, I do think, I mean, I was very young at that time, but I do hope I was conscious of the kinds of, prejudices or stereotypes you might be, spreading when talking about crime. And I remember one of the things I thought was social pathology. It's a very weird subject, which kind of looks at, alcoholism, drug dependency, and so on. A very, very bad name for a very, very bad subject. But I do remember consciously with that subject, whenever I taught it, I would be extra careful, because I knew that all of us present in the room, myself included, have had experiences related to that. So I was extra conscious about, attaching any stereotypes to these kinds of behaviors. And then I thought, was I equally conscious about crime? So do you ever think about how you talk to people about these things? Because we are so used to, talking about crime in a very specific way, kind of very, depersonalized way, but people within that room might have very personal experiences, either as victims or as perpetrators. Miha, I see you're unmuted.
Yeah, thank you for this example. It's really interesting. Actually, what Francesca said earlier, that she doesn't like using quotes because they might be taken out of the context. I'm also really cautious in using examples. I do like to use examples because, when you teach criminal procedure, it's very abstract, and you have to give them examples so that they can understand, what's the point you want to make. But it's really important that you know what kind of point you want to make with an example, and yeah. And not to give students the opportunity to be misunderstood, because I remember I got a feedback once in my teaching. Who thinks the student said, like, who in their right mind would think a murder was funny? So the student thought that I was making fun of the murders as such, but I was making totally different points, which made me realize you have to be careful. You have to be really careful. And I really like the point that Fergus made, this traveling between detachment and proximity, I think you said. I think that's actually a really good point when teaching this sensitive stuff. I like to use the term perspective taking, or maybe empathy, at least like cognitive empathy. I like to I ask my students often, like, imagine yourself being in the shoes of a defendant, or in the shoes of a witness, or a victim, or whatever, because it's really important that they understand all these perspectives, not to justify them or whatever, just to understand how every one of these stakeholders or procedural actors or people involved in a criminal justice system, they might have their own motivations, intentions, hardship, from a judge to the victim. And it's really important that they understand that from, as you said, like from the wider perspective, and also from their very intimate personal viewpoint.
Yeah, definitely. I've had a number of students after these prison visits who would tell me, okay, this has definitely persuaded me that I don't want to be a judge ever in my life, because I don't want to be responsible for, creating any types of penal outcomes such as these. So I think it's an important, and we are given this important opportunity, obviously, to do this. But the question is how far we can reach. Francesca, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, it's really difficult, because I'm always very aware that our students have all the widest possible backgrounds, and we know so little about them. We only find out either in moments of crisis or when someone comes and discloses something. I teach some classes that are quite wide, and they span several degrees, and I might have students on there who are studying for a policing degree and intend to be police officers. They have a certain view of the world, and other students who might have been criminalized in the past, or we have lots of students who seem to have very frequent police encounters and have different views. So I try to do kind of a generalized warning at the very beginning, remind everyone that these are not abstract things we're discussing. These are people's lives. It might not be your own personal experience, but it might relate to the experience of a person sitting next to you. And I know that try as I might to be careful and mindful of how I speak and not be stigmatizing, but I might make mistakes. But I also worry about how the students will interact with each other, because they might not always be aware that not everybody had the same experiences. And we do quite a lot of group discussions, and we do quite a lot of case study, example-based discussions, because just as Miha was saying, I think it's really important for them to be able to put themselves in the shoes of different actors, different circumstances. As you said, this is a sensitive topic that we teach. It's important to be sensitive and empathetic. We just simply cannot teach criminology or learn criminology if we don't empathize with victims of crime, if we don't empathize with people who are criminalized, if we don't empathize with the families, friends, neighbors of victims or those who are criminalized, if we don't empathize with people who have no knowledge of the criminal justice system but are scared, if we don't empathize with voters, policymakers. So we do these case studies a lot, and it helps a little get students to see things from different points of view. But at the same time, you also cannot really force them to take a point of view that is not theirs. Especially, I find second years who are quite young still, and they're quite, set in their views sometimes. So so it is a struggle. And I think I've had this conversation with Kerstin in the past about, not necessarily about being activists, but about what we teach and trying to teach, critical perspectives, or teaching the students about abolitionism, and finding sometimes quite a lot of resistance. I find sometimes that the more we try to be critical, and the more the students seem to come back with a more reactionary or conservative point of view, which just goes to show that they will just employ as much resistance to what we're trying to make them think as possible, which is great. It's a critical skill in itself, I guess. But yeah, so that's, sometimes it is an obstacle. I'm not quite sure what the right way is to get students to empathize while also be mindful of their personal experiences, and all of these factors and things that go on in their life that even we sometimes cannot even empathize with.
No, definitely. I think, this is one thing I've never actually thought about, which you mentioned, which is this kind of horizontal relations between students. You constantly think about your relationship with the students, but you don't really know what's happening behind the scenes and how they interact on different things. But I think, well, going back, I guess, to Kirsten's point, I think there is no way you can't. I mean, depends on how you define activism and what activism means for you. But I always feel like my task in disseminating knowledge, that's not good, in making for creative spaces in which we can learn and teach, is also to try to dispel some myths about crime, try to kind of, that there hasn't been a single subject I've taught that I didn't say to students at some point, we are all criminals. If you want to think about it, we've all done something in one way or another. So let's just talk about this in a very different way. Obviously, it will be very different. And Nicholas just made a point, hi Nicola, about the differences between the student bodies and the different perspectives you can get from criminology students and policing students. I remember I once taught a group that consisted of law students, policing students, and sociology students, and it's a very different teaching context. And some people require much less for the myths to be dispelled, and some people will hold on to their, stubborn prejudices. So it's also about, who you teach, and that's often a very complicated balancing game, I guess.
And also the relationship between who you teach and what you're teaching about. So to give you 2 examples from last year, the last time I taught my pervasive punishment course, that's an honours class in sociology at Glasgow. And I think I had about 30 or 40 students in the class. I think one of them was male. So I've got an overwhelmingly a class of mostly young women listening to lectures and engaging in discussion about the mass supervision predominantly of men. And, obviously there's consideration of gender within that course, but if I think about it as well, most of what I talk about, most of what I teach about, most of what I research is about people's experiences of being criminalized and punished. And the people in question are mostly men. And most of who I teach it to is women who are likely to be disproportionately on the receiving end of gender-based violence. And so there's a whole kind of set of dynamics to think about there in relation to the kinds of experiences that people might be bringing into the classroom. Obviously, those women in the pervasive punishment class might have fathers, brothers, cousins, uncles, sons who are caught up in criminal justice, and so there's lots of different ways of thinking that through. To give you another example, my postgraduate class on punishment and injustice last year had about 35 students who came from 13 countries in 4 continents, and many of them had practice experience either in policing or in courts or in some other context. So the way that they engage in a classroom discussion with me about the justification of punishment is different from what I would get in a sociology class. And I think the thing that I do to try to best facilitate learning, I'm not saying I'm any good at this, but this is what I try to do. I try to make the classroom a site of dialogue rather than a place of transmission. And it's extremely hard. At least I find it hard to do, as you're probably guessing from my contributions here. I find it hard to shut up in a class and enable dialogue to happen. But nonetheless, at least I try and think about what we're aiming for is that horizontal exchanges that challenge and extend and develop and improve our thinking. And I've got a job to facilitate that, both by bringing stuff to the conversation and by mediating the conversation between the students, bearing in mind that behind the student in the classroom is a life experience that I know very little about. So I think it's really complicated work, if we're honest about it. And the only kind of safe way to do it is dialogically and as sensitively as we possibly can.
Yeah, I think, Andy, can I pick on you for a second, if you're there? Because while Fergus was speaking, I thought about the fact that this does resonate a lot with the program we have at the University of Edinburgh, which is Global Crime and Justice, a security master's degree, where it is a lot of these things that we've talked about obviously appear, but they become much more complex and complicated given the wide variety of geographical spaces that our students are from. So kind of managing that on top of the problems that you usually have becomes even more complicated. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, although I think it is the strength of our master's programs and their international recruitment, although I think the university is more interested in the financial side of that than they are in the pedagogical benefits of it. But I think basically the classroom, when you have this kind of diverse knowledge base represented within it, becomes a place for putting that together to generate new knowledge. And it is, it's not to kind of diminish the challenge that Fergus is identifying there. I mean, I think it's a huge challenge. Sometimes I think it can involve bigging up the students in the room and humbling ourselves to make sure that they can see that they are active knowledge holders and knowledge generators in themselves, and then kind of celebrating the points where you're adding together bits of knowledge that haven't been together before to come up with something new or more solid. So I think, yeah, it's a big challenge, but I think it's a huge advantage of an internationalized education system.
Yeah, no, I agree.
We should just make it cheaper.
For a bit of activism. No, I think I just wanted to say it's also a matter of, because when you have these like diverse groups of students from different places, very often they learn from each other, right? Because there's so much of practice that they bring into that. And as Fergus said, a lot of our students also have this background in, or have worked or do still work within different elements of the criminal justice system. So you kind of become responsible not only for your own teaching, but for what goes on in the classroom, what gets said, and what kind of how people learn from each other. Not necessarily responsible, but you are a facilitator of that discussion and of that conversation. It just becomes more and more complex. Do you ever think about, and I guess this is probably one of the last questions, so if anyone wants to raise something important, now's the time. Do you ever think about kind of the responsibility even further than the classroom? Because very often you will, impact the students in a particular way, and you will, have discussions and conversations, and those students will leave their classrooms and go home or go into professional roles. And you will meet them in 5 years or 10 years, and they will, talk about things they've learned for you, and you might kind of stop and say, well, this wasn't really what I was trying to convey. Do you have any kind of, thoughts or strategies about how what gets said and what gets taught impacts on them as people? So it's like a full circle from you as a person and how you approach to them as a person and their kind of personal development and human development.
I unmuted myself real fast.
Yes.
Go for it.
Yes. First of all, it makes me laugh sometimes when I think about, just connecting real quick to the previous point. I might be talking about something and the students look at me like I'm just making it up, and then someone will interject and link it to their own personal experience, and then suddenly everybody's listening because it's a real thing then. It matters then. So it goes from, if I'm talking to them, they'll just be, trying to understand and hopefully have learning as a byproduct of that. But when they're actually talking to each other, then there's a curiosity there, and that transforms the co-creation of knowledge quite visibly. But yeah, I think the thing I try and hope to pass on is not necessarily in the notions that I'm trying to teach, but an understanding that the way things are is not necessarily the way things to be. And I try to do that when I teach, criminal justice, and we talk about how do these systems come to be? What roles do they have? Do they always, yes, they can be reformed. Do they need to exist in all these forms? And talking about migration policies, trying to talk about all these systems, all these ways of doing things, and then go deeper and deeper in the ways in which we organize society, in the way, is it all like that because it has a purpose, a logic, and it has to work like that? Or could actually things be done differently? And also realizing that these big systems that look like they're kind of carved into stone, they actually sometimes rely on like very accidental ways of being. And I find, as students like progress throughout the degree, and maybe they're going to, you can see them connect the dots. You can see them connect what they learned when they were talking about criminal justice and with what they learn about migration control and borders and about surveillance and about all of these initially disconnected topics, and start making it into a whole and a way of organizing things. And that is what they're going to take beyond in whatever it is that they do later. And I think that's our biggest responsibility.
Yeah. No, thanks so much. Micha, can I ask you, because I'm pretty sure that, your current students might tomorrow be your research participants because of the close proximity between academia and, the research environment. So how do you think about what you're doing now for what they will be doing later?
Now I'm being more and more intimidated. But it's true. Like, as you mentioned, our country is a specific, it's very small. So basically, we have one big law faculty and a smaller one, and that's basically it. So basically most of the lawyers would at some point, I would teach them at some point, I guess, and that's a weird feeling. But and of course, I think it can now, what Kirsten said, like, the relationship between activism and teaching. In a way, teaching is a huge activism project, and as somebody said earlier, in a bit good or bad way. So there's a huge responsibility in what kind of activism you engage when you're teaching. And as Francesca said, like at the end of the year or some, they have acquired some critical thinking, that they understand the system, that they are critical of the system. I think that's a thoroughly satisfying feeling. It's wonderful. But of course, things can go wrong way, and we shouldn't be too smug about it. We also have to be, I think, vigilant and check ourselves if perhaps we are, conveying a wrong message, or if we are understood in the wrong way.
Yeah. No, definitely. No, Kirsten, you've now pushed us towards the root of activism. I think to connect your two comments, I think there's also activism involved in a sense of kind of getting them to be curious and kind of, motivating them and pushing them to reflect and reconsider whatever gets taught and whatever. So there's an element of activism, bell hooks, yes, obviously, involved in that. Fergus, did you have some?
Yeah, I can be very brief because it's pretty much just I agree. One thing I'll say is that in both the courses I've mentioned, I explicitly end with not exactly a call to action, but a kind of an invitation to think about public criminology or public sociology, and whether or not what people have learned provokes them into action of some form, and whether it should. So those are conversations that I like to end those courses with quite deliberately. And then secondly, on the kind of, when things come back round and you don't recognize what you said, something you said, Milena, I have a kind of pretty relaxed view about that. When I left social work to become, first of all, a lecturer in social work, I did it because it seemed as if you could influence a whole cohort of social workers to be better social workers, that was a really kind of worthy thing to try to do, even if it also implies a certain arrogance. And then when I moved beyond social work and into criminology, I was also thinking about the kind of the possibility of influencing the development of professionals and policymakers and thinkers engaged with criminal justice in all sorts of different ways. And I can still remember, actually it was when I was a social work lecturer, the first time somebody cited me in an essay, and the sort of frisson of excitement that came with that. And then the disappointment that was all they did. And then the first time I was cited negatively in an essay by a student, who, you know, for something I didn't understand or something I'd missed, that was thrilling, you know. And as I've gone on over the course of 25 years, it's a more and more common experience to see people at all levels, from undergraduate to PhD research colleagues, criticizing your work in a constructive way and sort of going further. And that I find that incredibly hopeful, and also kind of chastening in just the right balance. But I think that makes me think I'm doing something right, even if what they've shown is that I did something wrong. I mean, how cool is that?
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, there's this constant conversation about, you know, politicians saying these academics are influencing our youth and getting them to think about, and we're like, we can't even get them to answer our emails. So it's not really, we're not very successful as it is. But yes, I think it's a really good matter for reflection and for consideration. Okay, so I think if everyone's happy, I mean, I know this always finishes with kind of people getting to think that there's so many new avenues open for discussion. That's what we hope to do with the next sessions. But yeah, I would just like to thank you all for either participating or for coming in other ways. I hope this was interesting, and I hope it was fruitful. And I'll make sure to keep organizing these sessions in the future. So thank you so much for your contributions.